the homeschool community is facing the same kind of propaganda that the rest of education is. And we are supposed to be trying to educate our children differently. And there does have to be some small group of Americans who are growing up not hating America and not seeing every bit of our founding, which was unique and beautiful, as the worst thing that ever happened in the history of the world. Welcome back to the Nicki Truesdale podcast. Today, my guest is Mary Grabar, author of two very important books that I want you to know about. One is called Debunking Howard Zinn, and one is Debunking the 1619 Project. And the content of these two books is so important to education, and not just public education, though their ideas have pretty much saturated public education. We have seen these ideas permeate all aspects of our society, if we're going to be honest, even the thinking of homeschool parents and some of the creators of homeschool curriculum. And that's what we're going to discuss on today's episode. So let me tell you a little about Mary Grabar. She earned her PhD in English from the University of Georgia in 2002 and taught at a number of colleges and universities in Georgia until 2013. While teaching, she wrote widely on political, cultural, and educational topics and founded the Dissident Prof Education Project, a nonprofit reform initiative. In 2014, she moved to Clinton, New York, and became a resident fellow at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. Mary, thank you so much for joining me, and welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, as a longtime homeschool advocate myself, I have answered a lot of questions over the years about curriculum and about teaching different subjects, and especially history curriculum. And the most surprising topic I get is on history. I have parents contacting me because they're afraid of spending too much time on Christopher Columbus, or afraid of portraying the Pilgrims or the Indians the wrong way, or they're even asking for a history curriculum that is not whitewashed. And I realize that they've been heavily influenced by Howard Zinn, even if they've never heard of him. So I want to start with your book, Debunking Howard Zinn. In chapter 2, you said this about him. He was a far left political activist, very possibly a member of the Communist Party USA. And the stories he puts into his book, A People's History of the United States, weren't balanced factual history, but crude morality tales designed to destroy Americans' patriotism and turn them into radical leftists. And I think you are 100% correct. So tell us, for those who don't even know who Howard Zinn was, and especially the subtitle of your book, which is Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America.
Yeah, well, Howard Zinn, on the best authority that we have, was a member of the Communist Party USA. He was born in 1922 to a Jewish immigrant family, and he grew up in, I believe it was Brooklyn, and lower middle class family, kind of struggling. And he came of age, was a teenager in the 90s, and the communists sent recruiters out into these neighborhoods to recruit young people. And of course, this was a time of hardship. It was the Great Depression, so they saw an opportunity. And Howard Zinn was swept up into it and attended some protests where he claims he was knocked unconscious by a policeman, and then he woke up in a doorway, and he came to this realization that this was not the land of the free and the home of the brave. It was very unjust that, people were persecuted, the rich had everything. And so that began his path into communism. And he worked as a dock worker, and he did enlist or was drafted into World War II in the waning days. He was a bombardier pilot and claims that he had a conversion and saw that any war was wrong because he was required to bomb civilians. And so then he became this kind of anarcho communist. He did not believe in government, and so he had his own brand of socialism. But we do have evidence that between around 1948, 1953, this was while he was He went back to school on the GI Bill to earn his PhD in history. He was teaching at some of these communist schools, and he was a member of the Communist Party, according to a careful analysis of his FBI files by Ron Radish, who happened to be have been a member briefly himself. So he knew what to look for in the FBI files, and determined that yes, he had been a communist from about 1948 to 1953. And of course, you don't go around showing your communist membership card, right? You're not going to have much influence that way, especially during that period of time. You're going to get in trouble with the government. So, Howard Zinn obviously was, told to be quiet about his membership, and decided to train the next generation of American students to be sympathetic to communism and to hate their own country. And he taught at a number of the communist schools, and worked as a teaching assistant, as you do when you're getting your degree, and ended up at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, which was, I believe it was a Presbyterian college for Black women, and very religious. They had a very strict dress code, curfew. The young women had to be, accompanied by someone else when they went off campus. They had chapel every morning. It was a Christian school, and this was his, first kind of proving grounds to transform a generation of young women who, had this rare opportunity to get a college education. This was 1950, when it wasn't, quite that easy to get a college education if you were a young Black woman. Mm-hmm. So he radicalized them and was subsequently fired by the college's first Black and male president for, quote, insubordination, because Howard Zinn was turning his students against the administration. He not only, fed them these Marxist texts and stories about how great, life under communism is, but he also encouraged them to complain to the administration and say, why do we have to have a curfew? Why do we have to have a dress code? Why do we have to go to chapel? He was an atheist, even though he was, born into a Jewish family. So he spread those ideas. And so he worked there from 1957 to 1963, was unceremoniously dumped as he was taking his family away for their summer vacation. There was a notice in his mailbox with a check, I think, for a semester's worth of pay, and said, we have no more classes for you. Good luck and goodbye. And he tried to sue and sent a bunch of crazy letters. And so he actually complained to this, Black male president, the first one, because they'd only had white presidents of this Black women's college. He said he was like a plantation overseer. And it went on, and President Manley finally threatened Howard Zinn with this old morals charge, where Howard Zinn had been caught with a young student on a side street late at night, parked. And a policeman came up to the car, knocked on the window, said, "What are you doing out here?" And of course, Howard Zinn claims it was an example of racism, and that he was actually, the student was only 17. And Howard Zinn, who was a middle-aged man by that time with a couple kids, said that he was advising her about her boyfriend. She had boyfriend troubles, which I taught for 20 years. I never felt that was part of my job, is to counsel students on their romantic problems. So, but nonetheless, he kind of, was, I don't know if he was unemployed but it only took him about a year to find a job at Boston College. And he was a thorn in the side of the president, John Silber, who was a good president and really wanted the school to get back to its purpose of educating students. But Howard Zinn specialized in just sort of holding informal 1960s styles rap sessions in the classroom and
Mhm.
leading students on anti-Vietnam War protests. And however, though he led them, he usually disappeared by the time the police came around.
Wow.
So that was Howard Zinn, and then he retired. I believe it was in 1988 or something, and he died in 2010. But his retirement years were very fruitful for his communist mission
Mhm.
of transforming and radicalizing students. And he continued that work. And actually, the day he died, he was, I believe it was Santa Monica, California, about to give a presentation to school teachers. So that was the long and very productive life of a Marxist and one time official Communist Party member.
Yeah, your book tells a lot about his teaching, his beliefs, his activism, and I think it's very important for people to understand that if he indeed was a member of the Communist Party USA, that wasn't just a group of Americans who thought communism might be cool. It was run by Comintern, which was from the Soviet Union. This was under the Soviets, and the Soviets had complete control over the Communist Party USA, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, you're absolutely correct, and they funded it. I
Yeah.
mean, um, Moscow Gold. That phrase used to be ridiculed by the anti-communists, and they would say, "Oh, this is a figment of, the reactionaries' imagination that there's this Moscow Gold coming here and funding all these subversive activities in the Communist Party." Agenda. But it's true. I mean, when once the Soviet archives were open to researchers after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, there were the receipts. So this was a group of people that swore allegiance to the Soviet Union, to our enemy.
And he was on a mission for the Communist Party USA, and it's littered throughout his book. You can, if you're familiar at all with not only Marx's original view of communism, but cultural Marxism, you can see it in page after page after page, basically pitting us against them, rich against poor, white against black, white against Indian. Whatever he can do to divide groups of people, he does. And his entire history of people's history of the United States, it's the actual history of America flipped upside down to make every underdog the hero, whether they were or not. And I just want to read a couple of quotes from your book that talk about how he treats history. And I want you to address a couple of things, but on Columbus, and we can thank Zinn for completely distorting what people believe about Columbus today and all that has happened in our society, honestly. But this is from your book. Images of unspeakable cruelty against a gentle people remain in the minds of countless students who have read Zinn's propaganda, and I will add, even those who haven't read it, and they now color the public discussion about Columbus. I think that is, it cannot be overstated what kind of havoc he has wreaked on the history of Christopher Columbus. About the Indians, and there's a whole lot about that in your book and in his. You say his account of the entire age of discovery is the same morality tale he tells about Columbus, which is summed up like this: Europeans bad, Indians good. And that is throughout the book. Whoever is white or European or male or Christian is always bad, and the other side is always good. He lifts selective portions of primary sources out of history about Jamestown, the Plymouth colony, the colonists in the American Revolution, and the relationships with various Indian tribes, and a whole lot more. And I think his aim, and I think you would agree, is just to create a tale that paints all Europeans as evil and all Indians as innocent babes exploited by the evil capitalists. In fact, capitalism is also bad, according to
Mm-hmm.
Zinn, which goes all the way back to Karl Marx. Zinn paints a very dishonorable history of the actual civil rights movement. And then, of course, you've talked about his role in the Communist Party. So tell us a little bit about what you think of his actual history.
Well, I mean, it would have taken a multi-volume work to go through every page of his people's history, which is over 700 pages long. But I looked at the key points, like you said, the discovery of America, the Revolution, the slavery, the Civil War a little bit, and the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War. So what he does is, yeah, he does have a bibliography, some footnotes, and he does point to some primary sources, to Columbus's journals, to other historians. But in the process, what he's doing is he's distorting what they say. Often he presents what they say as the opposite of what they actually said.
Yes. Yes.
And so very, very dishonest. And so someone who's very naive and wants to believe what he says will say, hey, he read all of Christopher Columbus's journals and he read all of this historian. No, he actually sometimes quoted from someone else who was quoting and then distorted it. So he's very dishonest in that way. He plagiarized as well. So I have examples and I describe exactly how he did all that, how he left out off words at the end of sentences, in the middle of sentences. And if you've ever taken an English course, you know how to use ellipses, and you use the 3 or 4 dots to indicate that you've left out words or a phrase or a sentence or two, but that essentially the meaning is the same as what the author said. Howard Zinn, though he was a professor, did not follow those rules. He just twisted things around. And unless, you're someone who, his book is intended not for other scholars, right? So he's not really a scholar. That was one of the complaints against him by the Spelman College president, was that he hadn't published anything academic. He hadn't published in any of the prestigious history journals or scholarly journals or any scholarly books. He was just publishing in radical, newspapers and magazines. So he wasn't really doing the work of a scholar. So this is not, a people's history. I mean, I'm not saying that every legitimate book of history has to have 1,000 footnotes in it, but it has to be honest, and you should be able to check up on it and,
Yes.
see if it conforms with what the tradition of history says and with what the reputable historians have said. But he's banking on the idea that this book will be read by people who really don't know much about history, who aren't all that curious, and by students. And of course that was true. The book was incorporated by teachers. Often at the beginning. Now, this book was published in 1980, so it's been around for 45 years now?
Yes. That's a lot of damage.
Yes. So, of course, at first it wasn't on, the approved reading list for teachers. And what teachers would do is they would sneak it into the classroom. And I've been at teachers' conferences where they've told others, okay, just photocopy certain pages, hand them out to your students, discuss them, and then be sure you collect them so they don't put them in their backpacks and show their parents. So
Clever.
But like you said, I'm not surprised that it's even entering the homeschool curriculum, because it's also, how there are chunks of Howard Zinn's A People's History in other textbooks, as I've discovered. So if you're checking out a book from the library that's middle school level about the Vietnam War, well, there are about 4 or 5 different passages that are quoted from Howard Zinn, and Howard Zinn is described as this distinguished, historian.
Yes.
PhD and all.
One of the quotes from your book is, I love this one. I think it's so accurate. American history became a tragedy in 3 acts: what we did to the Indians, what we did to the African Americans, and what we did to everyone else. And that's a pretty fair description of a people's history of the United States. It really is. And it's summed up as critical theory at this point. That's what it is. And, you were talking about his citations or lack of citations, properly quoting sources. You have, I counted, 973 citations in your book that debunks his. Zinn just includes a bibliography at the back of his book, which is just saying, these are some books that I base this on. No page numbers or quotes, taken from specific parts of papers or books. And then he said, to indicate every possible source of information in the text would have meant a book impossibly cluttered with footnotes. Well, footnotes are good. Please clutter your book with footnotes. That's how you check on the sources, like you said. And he's done the exact opposite of that. And I read recently about citation justice, which was a new form of critical theory to me, but it's kind of like he's gotten a pass somehow by not following the rules, as you said, and not properly citing sources and properly quoting those sources, but just saying, here's a list of books that I used. And everyone has to assume that what he's saying is the absolute truth from each of those books. I grew up homeschooled from the 6th grade on. And I was fortunate enough to read books that were based on primary sources. And one of those books was about Christopher Columbus. And so as I grew up and started hearing these weird tales of what Christopher Columbus did, that he was a genocidal rapist, I kept thinking, that's weird. I don't remember reading that part. And, it took me a few years to figure out what was going on. And that's how I discovered your book and discovered Howard Zinn's version of Columbus and just the mess that this story became. But it's not that. Zinn claims to quote straight from Columbus's journals. And yes, he picks out words, like you said, but not all of the words and not in context. And that's how he treats all aspects of American history. It's just a disaster. And it makes me sad when I see people referring to him as an honest historian.
Yeah, and to be fair, there are textbooks that don't really have footnotes. So
Mm-hmm.
when you're, respected as an educator and as an historian, there are certain facts about history, that have been established, and they've sort of become common knowledge. But what Howard Zinn is doing is he's turning that upside down.
Mm-hmm.
And for someone to be doing that, something so radical, he should be able to cite his sources. And so I think he wanted this to be seen as a book that was accessible to students, to high school
Mm-hmm.
students, and to the average person on the street who didn't want to read a long scholarly book.
Yeah.
And so he was banking on his reputation as a historian. So, he did have the degree. And so, people will say, well, he's got the PhD, and not questioning his motives. And also, he used these very sly rhetorical strategies to
Yes.
lure the reader in. So, but you can find out, I remember sitting and, going through the source that he used for Columbus. It was a cold January night, and I'm reading, his source, and I was like, that sounds familiar. Then I go to a people's history. It's like, here it is, the same thing. He's just changed around a few words. So, he knew what he was doing, and he was
Yeah.
very deliberate about it.
Well, that leads me to your other book, which is Debunking the 1619 Project. And I have the hardcover without the sleeve. So this is also a very important book. For my listeners who are unaware, can you explain what the 1619 Project is and why it's very important to be informed about this?
Yeah. Well, the 1619 Project came just as my first book was about to come out, the book on Zinn. And August
Yeah.
23rd, I believe, was the sixth anniversary of when the 1619 Project came out. And it was a special issue of the New York Times Magazine. And there was also a newspaper supplement which people sometimes forget. But the main part was the New York Times Magazine itself. It was dedicated to the 1619 Project. It's the brainchild of Nicole Hannah Jones, who is a reporter for the New York Times who writes on race and education. That's what she specializes in. And so she realized that we were coming up on the 400th anniversary of 1619, which is when the first Africans came to Virginia on a slave ship, and it's a date that has been commemorated in African American history. So if you know anything about it, she did not discover 1619. It's been known about, all along, but it was commemorated as a date, just like the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. So they had their date, and of course, the first Africans were brought over, and we don't know the number, we don't know the exact date, we don't know if they became slaves instantly. Probably not. They were probably indentured servants. But anyway, I'm getting off. So the 1619 project lands like a bomb in August of 2019. Immediately, historians started picking it apart, especially those who specialize in the Revolutionary War era, because one of the claims that was made by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who wrote the main essay, and then there were other contributors who had added everything from articles that related today's problems like traffic jams in Atlanta to slavery,
Yeah.
fashion or music, everything, went back to slavery. But Nicole Hannah-Jones had the main historical essay, and one of the claims she made was that the Revolutionary War was fought in order to preserve slavery. So
Mhm.
slavery was the motivation for the Revolutionary War, and there were some noted historians who got together and wrote letters to the New York Times and other publications and objected to this, her chronology. But nonetheless, the project went out. And in terms of education, it's kind of maybe not so coincidental that over, I think it was 3,500 prepackaged lessons with quizzes, excerpts were sent out to public schools just in time for the new school year. And it
Yeah,
was,
isn't that interesting? So quick.
yeah, yeah. So there was a lot of planning and a lot of money that went into producing
Yes.
this.
Didn't you say that the schools that implemented it got a $5,000 grant?
Well, yes, the Pulitzer Center. This has nothing to do with the Pulitzer Prize, but it's a center that's funded by left wing billionaires, and they have these workshops to encourage teachers to incorporate the 1619
Mhm.
project. And they bribe these teachers and they say, well, we'll give you $5,000 if you can come up with a creative new way to
Okay.
use these materials in your classroom, and join us for this webinar. And
Mhm.
so there are incentives given to teachers to use these materials, and so they've expanded their base.
Yeah. So this book, there's a little overlap between this one and Debunking Howard Zinn because a lot of the issues are the same. They're treated the same way. This one focuses heavily on slavery because the 1619 Project focuses heavily on slavery. And as you said, makes it seem like the Declaration of Independence was only about preserving slavery. And even the Civil War and the abolitionist movement, like they're they're treated as not doing any of it right and getting it wrong all the way through, despite the fact that slavery was abolished in the United States, and just trying to make our founders out to be evil men. Definitely attacking Thomas Jefferson with stories about the possibility of him sleeping with a slave girl and having children with her, the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln, not a hero. It's just crazy. But the focus to me again is on the Marxist feeling of resentment, us versus them. They did us wrong. We need to assert our power. And it's all throughout. And it's no surprise that if this already entered schools 6 years ago, that we're seeing the fruits of that. And I think it just comes on the heels of Zinn's work, which was already laying the groundwork for the very same ideas.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the oppressors versus the oppressed. It's the class struggle. It's always a struggle. Howard Zinn presented this view of the United States as having made no progress in terms of how blacks were treated and also women and other groups.
Mm-hmm.
And the 1619 Project takes the same tack. And I'm sure that if Howard Zinn were still alive, he would be applauding this.
Yes.
And I forgot to also mention that this project that was just a special issue of the magazine grew. It has since been published and expanded as a book, a very thick book, a children's book, a picture book that tells a very false story. There have been films made of it, produced by Oprah Winfrey.
Oh, yes.
Um, and artwork that has been commissioned. And Nicole Hannah-Jones had used her thesis of the 1619 Project to argue for reparations.
Mm-hmm.
There's an after-school program in Iowa, where she's from, and in other schools incorporating the 1619 Project materials. They're called the Freedom Schools, just like the 1960s schools in the Deep South were called. They're really indoctrination schools, but they were called the
Yes.
Freedom Schools. So it's become a whole industry. And then, of course, once the states started clamping down on its use in the classroom, they began screaming censorship, and they've been doing it
Mm-hmm.
ever since. So it's, it has been a quite a project. It's a, a capitalist dream. You have one thing and you have
How odd.
products, buttons, fashion, shirts, bags.
Which is ironic because this book is also anti-capitalist. It's so handy that they still get to benefit from the capitalism that they claim to hate.
Yeah, they always do. Yep, that's very typical.
One of the things you mentioned is how this fits with the goals of Common Core. And I know that some people will say Common Core was eradicated. It wasn't. It gets the names changed over and over, but the same idea is still in schools. And one of the things that you brought up, which I think is very true, is that the lines between, this is a quote, the lines between fiction and nonfiction have been blurred. Under Common Core, interpretations matter more than facts. Personal stories matter more than established history. And acceptance of diversity matters more than reason or logic. And I think this is one of the major problems we're seeing all over society, is that what I thought was true might not be true anymore because someone else has a different story or a different feeling. Or this is what I see in the homeschool circles. This doesn't talk as much about Indians as it does about Europeans. Or maybe there's too many white people in this story. And people are falling for that. And then you also say that a common method of critical race theory is presenting history through personal narratives. And you can just go on social media and see that every single day now, that it's a lived experience that matters way more than any historic fact. And so they're able to pretend to debunk historic fact that's been acknowledged and believed and understood for centuries. And so that's why I wanted my listeners to know about what you've done, because you have really dug deep and you have exposed the lies and the unhistory of Howard Zinn and Nicole Hannah-Jones. And I think it's important to understand that this is not just a public school problem, even though these ideas are definitely, like you said, already in the public schools. It's a societal problem. We see it in corporations and governments. It's just permeated our society. And my listeners span a couple of generations at least of homeschool parents. Most of them grew up public schooled, so most of them may have already had their history lessons embedded with Zinn's ideas. And, if they're on social media, which the younger generations always are, they're getting all of this thrown at them on a daily basis. But as homeschool parents, generally, we want something different than the government schools. And understanding Zinn and understanding the 1619 Project, both of them, which are heavily critical race theory, will hopefully help these parents when they're choosing wisely, when they're shopping for homeschool curriculum. So I wanted to ask you, based on all of this information that you have in your books, Do you have any tips or buzzwords that parents should look out for when they are shopping for a history curriculum for their kids?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, lived experience, and I would look at and see if there's a lot of an emotional appeal,
Okay.
because that's how Howard Zinn works, and that's how Nicole Hannah Jones works. So there are tales of suffering, and it's always of only one group of people, and the perpetrators are always one group of people, and so it's propaganda, and there's
Mhm.
no context. So we can say, well, yes, people did absolutely suffer under
Yes.
slavery. To be enslaved was not something that is that you should want to be. I mean, nobody wants to be enslaved,
We
and we
do
can
not
all.
condone slavery just by discussing
Right,
this topic. No.
right. But you have to sort of look at the whole picture. What was
Mhm.
life like for people in the 17th and the 18th centuries? How were the indentured servants treated? Yes, slaves were sometimes whipped, but so were workers and soldiers, as I point out.
Mhm.
Yeah, yes, there were slaves here, but they were all over the world.
Mhm.
And a lot of them and most other places were treated much worse than they were here. So you kind of have to look at the whole picture. So look at the tone. If it's really, trying to tug your heartstrings and provoke outrage, that's a clear sign. Not that we shouldn't feel sympathy for people, but if that's sort of the basic approach, then I think you've got to stand back and say, okay, something wrong with this. If one
Yeah.
group is constantly vilified and another group is presented as victims, there's something wrong with that. I used to teach my students, deliberately taught the story by Richard Wright, and it was written while he was in the Communist Party. He was the African American writer. And so I used it to teach students about propaganda. And it showed that all the communists were these very, unprejudiced, people who wanted advancement for blacks, equal rights, and all the racists, were anti-communists. So when you see
Mhm.
something like that, these stark contrasts of good and bad, and always by groups of people, that's a giveaway. So I think you kind of have to like read it. You can't just, simply look at the table of contents
Yeah.
and, have to evaluate it and get familiar with some of the sources. I mean, that's why I wrote my books, because I know, parents can't, spend days and days,
Yeah.
learning every part of history that's going to be taught to their children. And so I've gone back to some reputable sources, some reputable historians, and drawn on their work. And, you know, I think that the footnotes will provide another resource for people if they want to learn more about this,
Yeah, they do.
a specific lie that's told by Nicole Hannah Jones or Howard Zinn.
Yeah, that's what I appreciate is that you've done a super deep dive into each of the things explored in those original books, in Howard Zinn's book and in the 1619 project. You have done your due diligence so that other people don't have to, or they can start with yours. If someone loves to research, they can start with all the hundreds of footnotes in the back of the book. But for someone who doesn't have time, I encourage the homeschool parents just to get your books, to get those two books and read them. They're on Audible. You can just listen to them and give yourself a little bit of education, because the homeschool community is facing the same kind of propaganda that the rest of education is. And we are supposed to be trying to educate our children differently. And there does have to be some small group of Americans who are growing up not hating America and not seeing every bit of our founding, which was unique and beautiful, as the worst thing that ever happened in the history of the world. And that is
Mhm,
what these people are trying to present. And so if we want to give our kids a
mhm,
different view, it's not to say that America is spotless and wonderful and has never done anything wrong, because that's not the picture we're painting either, but to get the true story is getting harder and harder now. And I really appreciate what you've done to make that possible and to counter all this history that's coming out. Now, I notice you have a new book, Debunking FDR. Is that already out now?
Oh, yeah, it's been out for a few months.
Oh, good. Okay, I can't wait to read that one. And you have a website as marygrabar.com, isn't that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And I also have dissidentprof.com. And I do have an email list. So if you want to stay in touch, I just send out notices when I have articles or events coming up. And so I encourage people to sign up for that.
Okay, well, I will link all those in the description of this episode. And I just want to thank you again for not only all the work that you've done for Americans, but for coming and talking to my audience about it today. Thank you for listening to my podcast today. If you want more content like this, you can go to my website at nickitruesdell.com. That's NICKITRUESDELL.com. And find me on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
You're listening to the Biblical Family Network.